Beneath the shroud of a dying night, the stars hung like pale embers, their light stretched thin across the vast black gulf. Once, these heavens had burned bright, 1,000 suns proclaiming the glory of an empire whose reach had been without rival. Now, the constellations themselves seemed to wither, as if the cosmos were mourning the slow, inevitable death of its greatest child. Among the scattered ruins of that age, planets lay gutted and silent, their cities nothing more than skeletal spires reaching hopelessly toward the heavens. And upon the obsidian throne of the eternal palace, the last sovereign of this fractured dominion sat in shadow, his gaze fixed not upon the grandeur of the past, but on the horizon of its end. He was no stranger to the weight of centuries. Time had long ago ceased to touch his flesh, but the endless accumulation of loss had hollowed his soul in ways no blade could match. In the hall around him, columns of black stone rose like pillars holding the sky itself at bay, each etched with the names of worlds that had once sworn him loyalty. Names that were now only memories, reclaimed by silence. Yet tonight, even that silence seemed restless. An envoy had come from the farthest reaches of the eastern frontier, her armor dusted with the sands of dead moons. She had bowed deeply, her voice trembling as she delivered the words that tore through the stillness like a knife. The rebellion had begun, not a scattered riot of desperate men, but a coordinated rising. Ships, armies, and worlds aligned under the banner of a single commander. A commander whose name the ruler knew intimately. For centuries, they had fought side by side, shared victories, endured losses, and built this empire from the ashes of conquest. He had once trusted this man more than his own blood. Now, that trust was a shadow, broken and cold. He dismissed the envoy, her footsteps echoing away into the gloom, and sat alone in the vaulted hall. The thought came unbidden. Had he not been warned this would happen? Whispers had reached him over the decades, murmurs of discontent, claims that the empire had grown too distant, too heavy in its demands. He had ignored them, not out of arrogance, but because he believed time was on his side. Time, after all, was something he possessed in abundance. But now, as the stars seemed to fade above his realm, he wondered if that abundance had been his undoing. Immortality had kept him upon the throne, yet it had also chained him to every mistake he had ever made, every broken promise, every life crushed beneath the weight of his reign. He rose from the throne, the sound of his boots against the black marble floor, like the tolling of a funeral bell. Beyond the great archway lay the Hall of Crowns, where the visages of past emperors stared down in silent judgment. Their reigns had burned briefly but brightly, like meteors streaking across the firmament. His own reign had endured longer than all of theirs combined, but in that endurance lay the stagnation that now rotted the empire from within. Perhaps it was not betrayal that had doomed them, but his refusal to let go. The first drops of acid rain pattered against the palace's high windows, the storms outside reflecting the turmoil within. He walked to the eastern balcony, where the world below stretched out in a sea of crimson light from the burning districts. Even here, at the heart of his power, unrest had taken root. He could feel the city's pulse, a mixture of fear, resentment, and expectation. Somewhere beyond the blackened mountains, his former brother in arms was rallying fleets, gathering strength for the march upon this very capital. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the centuries fell away. He saw them together again, young, fierce, unstoppable. Two warriors who had believed they could carve their names across the stars forever. That belief had been a lie, as all such beliefs were. Time had not preserved them. It had only worn them down, grinding loyalty into dust. A voice stirred in the shadows behind him. It was one of his oldest counselors, a figure robed in the dark crimson of the inner court. The counselor spoke of striking swiftly, of unleashing the fleets upon the rebels before they could consolidate their power. But there was venom in his tone, an eagerness for blood that the ruler did not trust. The thought crossed his mind that perhaps the rebellion was not merely a matter of distance and dissatisfaction. Perhaps it had been cultivated, fanned into flame by hands within these very walls. He gave no answer. Instead, he turned back toward the balcony, watching as lightning forked across the horizon. Each flash illuminated the city's scars, streets torn apart, statues toppled, banners burned. The empire was already bleeding, and the war had yet to begin in earnest. His hand gripped the cold stone railing as a realization settled upon him like frost. No matter the outcome, something in this realm would die before the storm passed. Whether it would be his crown, his people, or the last fragile thread binding them together, that remained to be seen. And to you, the one listening now, we truly do care for you. Wherever in the great span of stars you may be, know that your presence here is part of this moment. Before we begin the long march of this tale, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, pour yourself a cup of coffee and settle in. The story of the silent judgment is about to unfold, and its echoes will carry far beyond the dying constellations. The rain had not ceased since the night the news arrived. It clung to the palace walls in heavy sheets, running down the gargoyle faces carved by artisans long dead, dripping from the edges of banners that no longer flew in the wind. In the throne room, the air was cold enough to mist with each breath, and the ruler's breath was slow, deliberate, as though measured against the ticking of a clock that only he could hear. The great hall was empty, save for a circle of counselors, each one a figure of immense influence, wrapped in silks, armor, or shrouds of ceremonial cloth. They stood at the foot of the throne, arguing in sharp, clipped voices, their words clashing like blades. To one side was Lord Varus, master of the naval armadas, whose fleets had once carried the banner of the Empire to the farthest corners of the galaxy. His voice was iron, demanding the immediate mobilization of the capital's warships. Crush them before they breathe, he urged, eyes burning with a predator's certainty. If we hesitate, they will entrench themselves. Strike now, and we will send their carcasses drifting in the void. Across from him, Lady Sereth, the Minister of Concord, leaned on her cane of white crystal, her every word as calm and measured as his were violent. They are not raiders or alien swarms, she said. They are our people, our soldiers, our kin. This is no foreign invasion, but a wound within our own flesh. If we cut too deeply, the patient will not survive. Send envoys, not executioners. Her gaze flicked toward the ruler, her eyes glimmering with something unspoken. Between them, the others weighed in, each voice carrying its own agenda. There were calls for spies to infiltrate the rebel lines, for assassins to cut off the head of the uprising. There were those who saw the rebellion as an opportunity, an excuse to claim new powers, to settle old rivalries within the court. The ruler listened to all of it in silence, his gaze drifting from face to face, weighing each one. He remembered these people from the Empire's golden years. They had shared triumphs and oaths, sworn to protect the realm with their lives. But as he looked at them now, he could no longer tell which of them still served the Empire and which served themselves. Immortality had taught him the bitter truth that loyalty could not survive unchanged over centuries. Time did not just erode stone. It wore away the bonds between souls until they became something unrecognizable. The chamber doors opened with a low groan, and a courier entered, soaked to the bone. In her hands was a scroll sealed with the sigil of the rebel general. The room fell into stillness as she approached the throne, kneeling before the ruler and offering the missive. He took it, his fingers brushing the wet parchment. The seal was unbroken. With deliberate care, he tore it open and read the words within. They were not a declaration of conquest. They were not even a demand for the crown. Instead, the general had written of broken promises, treaties ignored, distant worlds taxed into famine while the core worlds grew fat, frontier fleets left unreinforced against alien incursions. The general claimed to fight not for his own glory, but for the survival of those the empire had forsaken. And at the bottom, in ink dark as midnight, there was a personal line. "You once told me you would bleed for the people, but I have seen no blood from your throne." The ruler read those words again and again, as if repetition would change their shape. They struck deeper than any blade. In the shadows of his mind, he could not deny that some of it was true. The fringes had been neglected in recent centuries. Wars had been fought closer to the core, where the capital's influence was more secure. Resources had been drawn inward, and the outlying worlds had been left to fend for themselves. But he also knew this was not the whole truth. The general had chosen his moment well, painting himself as a savior while gathering fleets in secret. He handed the scroll to his steward without a word. Around him, the council erupted again, voices rising in a storm of accusation and demand. The call for war grew louder, more insistent. Yet Lady Serath's voice still carried through, reminding them all that a war within the Empire's own borders would tear apart everything they had built. When the council dispersed at last, the ruler remained seated, his hands resting on the cold arms of the throne. The chamber was silent, except for the steady rhythm of rain against the high glass windows. A figure emerged from the shadows of the side passage. It was Commander Rain, captain of the palace guard, a man who had fought alongside the ruler for longer than most of the galaxy's nations had existed. His armor bore the marks of battles too numerous to count, and his eyes were sharp, wary. "They are circling you," Rain said quietly. "Some seek to profit from this war before it begins. Others may already be feeding it." His gaze flicked toward the empty council benches, and for a heartbeat, the ruler thought he saw a rare thing in the commander's eyes: fear. The ruler dismissed him with a nod, but kept the warning close. That night, he walked the corridors of the Eternal Palace alone. The halls stretched endlessly, their walls lined with banners from every era of his reign. Here was the crimson pennant of the first expansion. There, the silver crest of the Treaty of Seven Suns. Each one represented an oath made, and in some cases, an oath broken. The weight of them pressed against him until his immortal frame felt suddenly, impossibly old. By the time he reached his private chambers, dawn was bleeding into the horizon, painting the rain-slicked city in the pale light of another storm-worn day. Somewhere beyond those mountains, his former brother in arms was preparing to test the Empire's strength and its soul. And though the ruler's heart was heavy, a part of him, buried deep beneath centuries of rule, still wanted to believe that loyalty could be reclaimed before it shattered completely. But another part, colder and sharper, whispered that the first blow had already been struck, and that every path forward would be paved in blood. The days that followed passed, like the measured beats of a war drum, each one echoing louder than the last. The city seemed to hold its breath, its streets crowded with whispers and the metallic scent of unease. Couriers came and went from the palace gates at all hours, bringing reports of skirmishes on the frontier and strange movements among the rebel fleets. Some spoke of planets switching allegiance overnight, swearing fealty to the general's cause without a single battle fought. Others brought darker tidings: supply lines cut, border outposts found abandoned, their garrisons vanished without trace. In the palace, the ruler stood before the great star map that hung like a living constellation across the war chamber's far wall. Each system shimmered faintly, its light denoting loyalty or rebellion. In recent weeks, the map's once brilliant spread of imperial gold had begun to dim, replaced by the cold steel hue of contested worlds. The encroachment was subtle but unrelenting, a creeping frost consuming the edges of his realm. Lord Varus was at his side, his voice a constant growl. Every hour we wait, they take another system. These people respect only strength. Show them hesitation, and they will tear you from the throne before the rebels even reach the capital. The admiral's gaze was sharp, but behind the steel there was ambition, the kind that could turn an ally into a rival given the right pressure. Lady Serath entered not long after, her cane tapping softly against the polished floor. She ignored Varus entirely, her attention fixed on the ruler. "I've received word from neutral mediators on the border," she said. "The general's envoys are willing to meet in the city of Vardessa on the moon of Clythe. It's a neutral ground. If you send your own representatives, there is still a chance to talk before this becomes total war." The suggestion was met with immediate derision from Varus. "Vardessa is a trap. They'll use the talks to buy time while they fortify their fleets. Every day wasted is a nail in the Empire's coffin." The ruler listened in silence, but his mind was elsewhere. Vardessa, a name from long ago, a place where treaties had once been sealed between mortal enemies. He remembered standing with the general there centuries earlier, back when they were still brothers in arms. He could still see the way the twin suns lit the marble streets, hear the distant bells that had rung in the hour of peace. That memory weighed heavily on him now, for it seemed almost impossible that the same man who had stood with him in that light would now stand against him in darkness. He did not give his decision aloud, but that evening a message was sent under the most secure cipher. The Empire would send a delegation to Vardessa. The ruler, however, would not place the matter entirely in others' hands. Quietly, he summoned Commander Rain to his private chambers and gave him orders no one else would hear. "You will lead them," the ruler said, his voice low. "But your task is not only to speak. Watch, listen, find the truth behind his rebellion. If it is as he says, we may yet avert this. If it is not, I will know who holds the knife at my back." Rain bowed, his eyes meeting the ruler's for only a heartbeat, before he turned and left. The ruler remained alone in the chamber, the rain whispering against the windows, as though the world itself knew the weight of what was to come. The days leading to the summit were restless. Rumors of discontent within the capital's own garrison began to spread. 2 officers were caught trying to smuggle arms to rebel sympathizers. The executions were swift, but their effect on morale was poisonous. Soldiers patrolled the streets with hollow eyes, their armor dulled by the constant storms. In the marketplaces, merchants spoke in hushed voices, their eyes darting to the palace towers as if they expected them to crumble at any moment. Then came the blow that stripped away any illusion of control. On the third night before the talks at Vardessa, an assassination attempt shook the heart of the capital. The attacker struck not at the ruler, but at Lady Serath, ambushing her carriage on the eastern bridge. She survived, though gravely wounded, and her guards swore the assailant bore the markings of the rebel fleet. Yet the precision of the attack, the ease with which the assassin breached the city's defences, it did not fit the crude aggression the rebels were known for. The ruler visited Serath in her recovery chamber. She was pale but unbroken, her eyes clear despite the pain. "It wasn't him," she said, before he could speak. "The general would not waste his blade on me before the talks." "This came from closer than you think." Her words struck deep. He left without replying. But as he walked the long corridor back to his chambers, the certainty grew within him that the war was not simply between his empire and the rebellion. There were other hands on the board, moving pieces in shadow. The question was, how many of them sat within his own walls? When dawn came, the ruler stood again at the balcony, watching the horizon. Lightning forked in the distance, the light briefly revealing the jagged silhouette of the mountains. Somewhere beyond them, the general was waiting, and between them stretched a gulf, not only of space, but of truth. Truth tangled in betrayal, ambition, and secrets buried beneath centuries of loyalty. He could no longer tell if meeting him in Vardessa would bridge that gulf, or open it wide enough to swallow the empire whole. The emperor's children, those once regarded as paragons of martial perfection and refined culture, had not always been bound to the curse that would one day consume them. In the beginning, they had been the pride of the Imperium, the very embodiment of the emperor's dream. Their primarch, Fulgrim, had been a being of unparalleled grace, a warrior whose swordsmanship was unmatched, an orator whose words could stir the hearts of millions, and an artist whose vision sought to elevate humanity above the baseness of war. In those early years, he believed utterly in the Great Crusade, in the unifying light of the Emperor, and in the ideal that humanity could ascend to something greater. Yet, it was this very hunger for perfection that would prove his undoing. Perfection, after all, is not a fixed point, but an ever-retreating horizon. To chase it is to commit oneself to a journey without end. And Fulgrim was not one who tolerated limits, not in himself, not in his warriors, and not in the galaxy they were sworn to bring to heel. The Emperor's children became infamous for their meticulous discipline, their shimmering armor polished to a mirror's sheen, their every maneuver executed with balletic precision. To fight alongside them was to witness an art form. To fight against them was to face a predator that saw the kill not as necessity, but as performance. They fought with an elegance that bordered on cruelty, and even in those days there were whispers among other legions that the Third took too much pride in the beauty of destruction. The seeds of corruption were sown in subtle ways. Fulgrim's thirst for refinement led him beyond the rigid codes of the Legiones Astartes, seeking inspiration in the cultures they conquered. He surrounded himself with artisans, poets, and musicians from 100 worlds, demanding of them not mere craftsmanship, but transcendence. The line between admiration and obsession began to blur. The trappings of war became gilded and adorned, blades encrusted with gems, bolters filigreed in gold, battle standards woven from silks worth more than cities. To the Emperor's children, this was not vanity. It was the ultimate expression of their devotion to the Imperium. The galaxy would be remade not only in order, but in beauty. Yet beauty is a dangerous master. It demands more, always more. Victories were no longer enough. They had to be perfect victories. The kill had to be not only clean, but sublime. It was in this pursuit that Fulgrim's fate began to entwine with whispers from beyond the veil. Subtle temptations found their way into his ear, encouragements that perfection could only be found by transcending the limits imposed by mortal flesh and rigid discipline. It was the voice of Slaanesh, though Fulgrim did not yet know its name. The Prince of Excess saw in him a perfect vessel, a soul already devoted to the endless pursuit of sensation, refinement, and the unreachable horizon. The turning point came during the cleansing of Leren. The Emperor's children, deployed to annihilate an alien species known as the Lair, found themselves on a world of dizzying beauty and terrible decadence. The alien architecture spiraled like frozen music, their weapons crafted from crystal and living metal, their culture steeped in ritual pleasures that mingled artistry and carnage. Fulgrim, upon entering the heart of their temple, discovered a blade unlike any forged by human hands, the Lair blade, a weapon that seemed to sing in his grasp. It was a masterpiece, and like all masterpieces, it demanded an owner worthy of it. What Fulgrim could not see, or perhaps refused to, was that the blade carried within it a fragment of a demon, a whispering parasite of the warp that began its slow work on his mind from the moment he touched it. After Leren, Fulgrim was changed. His perfection became more than an ideal. It became a hunger. His speeches grew more fevered, his demands of his legion harsher, his punishments for imperfection more brutal. Warriors who once took pride in their flawless execution now feared the scrutiny of their lord, for nothing short of the impossible would satisfy him. The Emperor's children began to indulge in excess, first in their warcraft, then in their celebrations, and finally in every aspect of their lives. Their pursuit of perfection no longer elevated them, it consumed them. Even the war records of the time show a shift. Where once the Third Legion had been a surgical weapon, cutting swiftly and decisively, they now lingered in their wars. They prolonged sieges, orchestrated battles not for expedience but for spectacle, crafting massacres that would be remembered for their artistry. The suffering of the enemy became part of the performance, the cries of the dying a chorus to their glory. The line between art and atrocity was obliterated, and they did not care to redraw it. Fulgrim's friendship with Horus, once a bond of mutual respect between two of the Emperor's finest generals, became another thread in the tapestry of betrayal. Horus, already walking the path of rebellion, saw in Fulgrim both a potential ally and a dangerous fanatic. The War Master understood that to sway the Emperor's children was to unleash upon the Imperium a weapon that would not simply kill, but corrupt. It was not hard to convince Fulgrim that the Emperor had betrayed his own vision, that he had abandoned the pursuit of perfection for the chains of order and stagnation. In Fulgrim's mind, rebellion became not treachery, but liberation, a chance to ascend beyond the constraints of imperial law. By the time the heresy began, the Emperor's children were unrecognizable from the legion they once were. Their armor, once resplendent in purple and gold, now shimmered with colors that seemed to shift and writhe, as though alive. Their war cries had become songs, their ranks moving with a terrible, unnatural grace. The Lair blade never left Fulgrim's side, its demon whispering to him, feeding him visions of beauty and ecstasy beyond mortal comprehension. Every world they touched became a canvas, and they painted in blood, fire, and ruin. In the end, the tragedy of the Emperor's children was not that they fell to corruption, but that they did so willingly. They did not stumble, nor were they dragged. They danced into damnation with open eyes and exultant hearts. For them, there was no line between devotion and decadence, no difference between art and atrocity. In their minds, they had achieved the perfection they had always sought. And if the rest of the galaxy could not understand it, that was only proof of its inferiority. The days following the exodus from their dying homeworld were marked by silence. Not the peaceful quiet of serenity, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a people who had left behind not only their cities and seas, but the very soil that had birthed them. The stars became their sky, and the endless black void became their horizon. For the silent king, every breath was a reminder of the weight upon him. The survival of his people bought at a cost he could not yet measure. The cold truth lingered in the hearts of the Necrontyr. They had been saved, yes, but in ways that stripped them of the life they had once known. At first, the changes brought by the pact with the Citan seemed like salvation. The disease that had ravaged them, the curse of their short lives, was gone. Pain was gone. Hunger was gone. But so too was warmth. No heartbeat pulsed in their chests. No blood flowed through their veins. They had traded frailty for immortality, yet discovered too late that immortality without sensation was an endless winter. Families no longer embraced one another for comfort. They only stood together out of habit, their forms now cold metal shells that mimicked life but no longer felt it. The Citan, those star-born gods of living energy, had delivered on their promise with the cruel precision of cosmic predators. They had remade the Necrontyr into the Necrons, undying, tireless, and perfect instruments of conquest. The Silent King had hoped that such power would allow his people to flourish in the galaxy, to finally rise above the decay and misery that had defined their existence. But the reality revealed itself like a slow wound opening in his mind. The Citan had not given them bodies. They had taken their souls. What now inhabited the legions of the Necrons were shadows of consciousness, fragments of what once had been whole beings, slowly eroding under the weight of eternity. Yet the war against the Old Ones demanded that these doubts be silenced. The Silent King commanded his new legions into battle, and the galaxy shook under their advance. Planets that had once seemed untouchable burned under the green fires of Gauss weaponry. The Old Ones, ancient beyond comprehension, found themselves hunted, cornered in star systems that had never known war. The Necrons did not tire. They did not retreat. They did not fear death, for death no longer claimed them. Every victory fed the pride of the Necrontyr, now transfigured into something colder and more mechanical. A pride built not on life's triumphs, but on domination and annihilation. But within the mind of the Silent King, unease festered. He began to notice how his people, his warriors, his nobles, even those who once ruled beside him, grew distant, their thoughts dimming like fading stars. Some were no longer capable of original thought at all, their minds reduced to programs of obedience and war. It was as if the very essence of what it meant to be Necrontyr was being erased, replaced by a hollow efficiency. Even the highest lords, those who had sworn their loyalty to him in life, now regarded him with empty eyes, following his commands without understanding why. The Citan had done more than transform their bodies. They had reshaped their will. Still, the war escalated. The Silent King could not afford hesitation, for the Old Ones had powers even the Citan feared. Mastery over the webway, the strange labyrinth that allowed instant travel across the galaxy, and the ability to shape life itself into weapons. But for all their strength, the Old Ones were not immune to attrition. World by world, the Necrons closed their grip. The C'tan feasted on the destruction, growing ever more radiant, their hunger for mortal souls unquenchable. To the Silent King's horror, he began to see that the C'tan's true war was not against the Old Ones alone, but against all life. The Necrons were their instruments not just of conquest, but of harvest. And yet, the Silent King pushed forward. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was because he feared that if the Old Ones survived, they would bring a retribution so complete that the Necron's suffering would be meaningless. In every battle, the galaxy seemed to dim, as though the light of countless stars was being drained by the relentless will of his armies. And though victory seemed within his grasp, the Silent King felt no joy, no triumph. He knew that the war he fought was no longer truly his own. It was in the quiet moments between campaigns that the truth pressed hardest upon him. The Necrons could win the galaxy, but in doing so, they would lose themselves entirely. And he, Sharek, last and greatest ruler of the Necrontyr, would be remembered not as the saviour of his people, but as the one who delivered them into an eternal soulless night. The skies above Prospero burned red, though no sun graced its horizon. Instead, the light came from the fires of war that spread like a living plague across the once proud world. The air trembled with the roar of bolters, the shriek of psychic lightning, and the echo of 1,000 dying voices. It was a symphony of ruin, composed by betrayal and played to the rhythm of extinction. The 1,000 suns fought with desperate precision, their psychic might carving through the enemy like blades of thought and will. They were scholars, warriors of intellect and mysticism, but in this moment they were cornered animals, fighting for a future that had already been stolen. Above it all, Magnus stood upon the highest spire of Tizca, his crimson armour gleaming like molten gold in the dying light, his single eye burning with anguish and wrath. Below him, the space wolves advanced, a tide of ceramite and fangs, led by their savage king, Leman Russ. They moved with the inevitability of a storm, their howls shaking the sky, their bolters spitting death. The fang had been unleashed upon Prospero by the Emperor's command, or so they had been told. But beneath the layers of truth and lie, Russ's heart was not filled with the pure righteousness of justice. There was a shadow in his eyes, an unspoken understanding that this was not entirely his choice, yet he would see it through with the fury of a wolf hunting prey. Magnus had known this day would come. He had seen it in visions long before the first drop pod tore through Prospero's sky. He had tried to prevent it, to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery, but in doing so had broken the one law his father had demanded he obey, never to walk the paths of the warp to trespass upon Terra. Magnus had shattered that command with his desperate psychic intrusion, and in his urgency, he had unwittingly damaged the very walls that held back the great enemy. It was the crime the Emperor could not forgive, or perhaps would not forgive. Tizca, the jewel of Prospero, had been a city of learning and wonder, its streets alive with debate, magic, and the study of the universe's mysteries. Now, it was a killing ground. Magnus's sons fought with precision born of centuries of training, but against the wrath of the wolves and their allies, their resistance was a candle before a hurricane. Rubriki fell in droves, their armour cracked and their bodies torn apart by bolter shells and chain blades. Sorcerers unleashed storms of psychic fire, incinerating whole squads, only to be brought low by the fury of the Fenrisian blades. The two Primarchs were destined to meet amidst this slaughter. Russ carved his way through the heart of the city, his frost blade dripping with blood, his breath heavy in the thin air. Magnus descended from his spire, not as the warrior he could be, but as the brother he once was, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that words might still turn the tide. When they finally stood before one another, the war around them seemed to fade. Russ's voice was a growl, his every word a blade meant to cut deep. Magnus spoke of truth, of manipulation, of how they were both pawns in a greater game. But the wolf had come for the kill, and the Crimson King's plea was met with steel. Their battle was like the clash of gods. Russ fought with the savagery of a beast unleashed, every blow driven by loyalty twisted into wrath. Magnus moved with the grace of a scholar warrior, his psychic power wreathing his form in light and shadow. They struck at one another with a fury that shook the ruins around them, each blow echoing the years of brotherhood and rivalry they had shared. But in the end, it was not Magnus's strength that failed him. It was his will. He could not bring himself to kill Russ, even as the wolf drove his blade deep into his flesh, shattering bone and hope alike. Broken and bleeding, Magnus fell to his knees. Around him, the 1,000 suns were dying, their future reduced to ash and ruin. Russ looked down at his brother, a momentary shadow of regret flickering across his features, but it was gone as quickly as it came. The deed was done. Prospero was lost. It was then that the air itself seemed to split apart, reality twisting into something alien and terrible. A voice called to Magnus, ancient and cold, offering salvation wrapped in damnation. In his final moments of mortal pain, the Crimson King accepted the bargain that would forever damn his legion. The warp swallowed him whole, and Prospero burned brighter than ever, a beacon of betrayal visible across the stars. The Space Wolves withdrew, leaving behind a world reduced to ruins, its libraries turned to smoke, its people slaughtered or scattered to the winds. For the 1,000 suns, nothing would ever be the same. They had been a legion of seekers and dreamers, but from that day forth, they would be exiles, cursed and bound to a fate darker than the void. And in the warp, Magnus opened his eye once more, not the eye of a man, but of a demon prince. He had saved his sons from death, but not from the price they would pay for eternity. His heart still beat with the memory of his father's disappointment, of his brother's blade, of a city turned to ash. And as the warp howled around him, he knew the truth. Prospero had not fallen because of the wolves or the Emperor's wrath. It had fallen because he had dared to believe he could outwit fate. The galaxy trembled beneath the tread of marching boots and the roar of engines that had not slept for millennia. Across 1,000 war zones, banners of every color and creed bled their pigments into the dust. But far beyond the chaos of mortal wars, in a corner of the galaxy untouched by imperial census or Xenos chart, something ancient was stirring. The void itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that one more piece was moving on the board, and its movement would redraw the map of destiny. It began in whispers, rumors carried by traders who swore they had seen fleets in the deep black, ships without markings, moving in perfect silence. No distress calls, no challenges, only the shimmer of engines older than the Imperium itself. And as these rumors spread, so too did fear, for in the far reaches of the segmentum obscurus, worlds were vanishing. Not conquered, not destroyed, simply gone. The Administratum filed these events under piracy, warp storms, or unfortunate accidents. The Inquisition, however, knew better, and among their number, A handful remembered the old legends, tales of a fleet that had been lost to history, sworn to never raise arms again, until the day their oath was broken by a debt that could not be forgiven. It was on the dead world of Carthion Prime that the first true sign appeared. Once a thriving forge world, it now lay silent beneath a sky choked with ash. Imperial Survey, teams who landed there reported no signs of struggle, no bodies, no debris. Only perfect stillness, as though every living thing had been plucked away in a single heartbeat. And at the heart of the manufacturer district, they found it. A single blade planted into the ground, its surface black as the void, and upon its hilt, a sigil no one in the team could recognize. It was not of Imperial make, nor alien. It belonged to something older, something that had once fought beside the Emperor before his Imperium was born. Before the surveyors could transmit their findings, their ship vanished from the Auspex logs entirely, leaving nothing but static. From that moment, the Inquisition moved with urgency. Dispatches were sent to Ordo Xenus, Ordo Malleus, and Ordo Hereticus alike. Names long buried in sealed archives were whispered again, names that once had been spoken with reverence and dread. Chief among them was the Vigilant Star, a vessel whose last recorded voyage ended in the darkness beyond known space, carrying with it a crew bound by an oath to never return until the debt owed to them was repaid in blood. Some claimed they were a remnant of the Great Crusade, disillusioned and betrayed, who abandoned the Emperor in secret. Others insisted they were something more, a legion not of space marines, but of something older, stronger, whose loyalty had been purchased by the Emperor in an age before Terra was united, and now they were back. On the world of Ikaros Afiv, the first engagement took place. Imperial patrol craft caught sight of an unmarked fleet moving through the system without broadcasting ident codes. At first, they believed them to be smugglers or pirates, until the shapes emerged from the void, warships of unfamiliar design, their hulls covered in script so ancient the machine spirits of the Imperial ships refused to process it. Vox hails were sent. No answer came. When warning shots were fired, the response was swift and brutal. Energy weapons, the likes of which had not been seen since the dark age of technology, tore through the patrol ships as though they were paper. And then, just as quickly, the fleet vanished into the warp, leaving behind only drifting wreckage and a lingering fear that the Imperium had just woken something it could not contain. Word reached Terra slowly, buried under layers of bureaucratic delays and deliberate obfuscation. But among the High Lords, a shadow passed, one of recognition. Some among them remembered the truth of the Vigilant Star, though they would not speak it aloud. The return of this fleet did not merely mean another war. It meant that a pact had been broken, and when old pacts were broken, the galaxy burned. Quiet orders were given to the Adeptus Custodes to watch and listen. Astropathic choirs were directed to search for whispers in the immaterium, and certain chapters of the Adeptus Astartes were discreetly warned. If the unmarked fleet entered their sector, they were to engage without hesitation. But what the Imperium failed to understand was that the fleet was not hunting them. Not yet. They had returned for something far older, something that even the Emperor had once feared. And as they moved through the darkness, their leader, clad in armor that had not seen the light of a star in 10,000 years, spoke only a single command to his crew. It was not an order of conquest, nor one of vengeance. It was the beginning of a hunt for the one who had broken the oath and stolen from them the only thing they had sworn to protect. In the silent corridors of the vigilant star, engines thrummed like the heartbeat of some titanic beast. Its captain stood at the viewing deck, staring into the void as if he could already see his prey. His voice was low, almost reverent, as he whispered a name, one that had not been spoken in 10 millennia, a name that would, once uttered again, set the galaxy on fire. And as the ship vanished once more into the black, the stars themselves seemed to tremble, for they knew that in the games of gods and kings there are no second chances, only the inevitable return of debts long owed. Far across the black gulf of space, the tendrils of the hive mind stretched like unseen claws, brushing against the edges of yet another unsuspecting system. It did not arrive with the thunder of warp storms or the heraldry of a conquering fleet. It came as silence. In that silence, the worlds of the frontier continued their routines, oblivious to the fact that their skies would soon be blotted out. The hive mind did not rush. It consumed with patience, as a spider waits for its prey to entangle itself further in the web. Each tendril of thought pressed deeper, probing, assessing, learning. Every biological pattern, every genetic quirk, every shred of information about the prey was taken and filed away in the incomprehensible memory of the swarm. There was no hatred in its approach, only inevitability. The first to sense the coming doom were not the planetary governors or their guards, but the psychers. On mining colonies and orbital stations, astropaths began to scream into the void, their eyes glazing over as if seeing something their minds could not contain. Many clawed at their own faces or fell into catatonic states. Others simply died, their hearts stopping in perfect unison with the unseen whisper. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica dismissed these as isolated incidents at first, a natural hazard of working so close to the Immaterium. But soon, the voices of the Imperium's psychic relays fell silent, not because the hive mind had crossed into the warp like a demonic foe, but because it had simply smothered the minds it touched. Where chaos corrupted, the hive mind erased. On the agri-world of Kalthros 5, the last harvest was already underway. The farmers knew nothing of the cosmic predator approaching. In the cities, imperial propaganda played as normal, endless oaths to the emperor, reminders of duty and sacrifice. The PDF drilled in the courtyards, unaware their laser guns would soon prove as useful as sticks against the coming tide. The nobility debated tariffs in high halls of marble, blissfully ignorant that their riches would soon be reduced to bone. This ignorance was not unusual. The hive mind thrived upon it. It wanted its prey unaware until escape was no longer possible. When the first shadow fell upon the system, it was not a ship that was seen, but the dimming of the stars themselves. The outermost orbital pickets reported flickers of biosigns where there should be none, impossibly large heat signatures moving without propulsion. A week later, those same pickets vanished, their transmissions cut mid-sentence. No wreckage was found, only drifting debris, gnawed clean. The system's fleet, small and poorly maintained, was hastily scrambled. The void crews whispered about the Tyranids, old ghost stories told by battle-worn voidsmen who swore they'd seen the sky alive with wings. Official orders forbade such talk, but fear had already rooted itself. The hive mind's arrival was never loud. It was the quiet shifting of billions of organisms into place, the coordination of claws, tendrils, and teeth into a single perfect trap. Mycetic spores began to seed the upper atmosphere of Kalthros 5 before the populace even realized the fleet was gone. The spores were not weapons in the conventional sense. They were seeds of infestation, drifting down like a sick parody of snow. Where they landed, life twisted. Plants grew swollen and strange, roots writhing like worms. Animals became aggressive, their eyes glazing with an alien hunger. Even humans were not spared. Isolated settlements reported sicknesses that caused the skin to harden, the eyes to darken, and the mind to fragment into primal rage. The infected were executed without question, but it did not matter. For every one killed, another two emerged. The governors appealed to the nearest imperial command for aid, but the message was slow, and the Imperium was vast. Help might come in months, perhaps years, if at all. By the time the first reinforcements left Warp, the shadow in the system had grown so thick that ships reported their augurs blinded, their crew plagued by nightmares. The hive mind was inside their thoughts. Some captains turned their ships around before even reaching the embattled worlds, unwilling to risk the slow, inevitable draw into the swarm's hunger. The Tyranids had no need to chase cowards. There was always more prey ahead. On Calthros 5, the sky finally broke. The clouds themselves seemed to rot as bioships entered low orbit, disgorging endless streams of spores. Each one carried death, not the clean death of a weapon's blast, but the slow, creeping death of assimilation. Capillary towers erupted from the ground, vast organic pillars that drilled into the planet's crust, pumping its biomass toward the growing hive structures. The PDF fought valiantly, but their lines collapsed in hours. Lasfire cut down countless creatures, but for every one slain, 10 more pushed forward, stepping over the corpses of their kin as if they were nothing. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, only the absolute certainty of purpose. By the third day, the last organized resistance fell. Entire cities were swallowed whole, their structures broken down into raw matter for the swarm. The hive mind did not leave ruins in its wake. It left nothing. Every scrap of biomass was consumed, every organism stripped to the molecular level. Even the oceans were drained, the air itself thickened with the stench of digestion. And when the last human scream was silenced, the swarm did not linger. It turned its endless gaze outward, toward the next source of life. The system had been reduced to barren rock, its memory carried only in the mind of the hive. Somewhere far away, an imperial vessel finally arrived, expecting a desperate plea for aid. Instead, its auspex found a lifeless system, every world cold and silent. The captain ordered a hasty withdrawal, unwilling to dwell under the unnatural darkness that still clung to the void. He did not realize the truth. The hive mind already knew the location of his homeworld. It had tasted his crew's thoughts, and it was already moving toward them, patient and certain, as it always had been. Under the endless void of the galactic night, the silent king drifted between the stars, a lone monarch in exile. His ship, a relic of the Necrontier's ancient glory, moved without haste, its hull blackened by the dust of forgotten worlds. For millennia, he had wandered like a ghost, haunted by the echoes of voices long silenced, by the weight of a crown forged in mistakes. Once, the name Sharek had commanded entire civilizations. Now, it was whispered only by those who feared the memory of him. He had left his people behind not from weakness, but because he believed it was the only path to save them. Yet the question gnawed at him. Had he abandoned them to an eternal damnation, or preserved them from something worse? The stars were his only witnesses. Each one seemed to judge him, casting cold light upon a soul burdened with choices no ruler should have to make. His mind returned again and again to that moment, the pact with the Citan. The memory was like a blade, sharp and cold. He had led the Necrontyr into a transformation that had granted immortality at the cost of their souls, replacing fragile flesh with living metal. It had been salvation and damnation in one stroke. Now, countless eons later, the galaxy was shifting once more, and he felt the pull of destiny clawing him back toward the heart of the storm he had once fled. In the depths of interstellar silence, the Silent King began to feel a change. The warp winds whispered warnings even he could not fully understand. Faint signals drifting through the dark spoke of an enemy unlike any before. Vast, hungry, mindless. They came from the edge of the galaxy, where stars grew thin and cold. Worlds vanished without trace, their light snuffed out as if swallowed whole. He remembered the whispers of his seers before the war in heaven had ended, of a darkness that would come when the galaxy's fires dimmed, a predator that consumed all. The Tyranids. He watched the patterns of their approach, mapping their advance across void space. The scale was incomprehensible. These were not fleets, but swarms, moving as if guided by one vast unseen mind. Their hunger was beyond reason. It was not conquest they sought, but consumption. And in their path lay every living thing, including the scattered remnants of the Necron dynasties. A truth as heavy as the crown upon his brow began to crystallize. The galaxy he had abandoned was now threatened by an enemy that made the Citan seem almost merciful. The temptation to turn away was strong. Let the galaxy burn. Let the creatures devour the Imperium, the Orcs, the Eldari. Let them all vanish, as the Necrontyr's enemies had vanished long ago. It would be justice of a kind. Yet, deep within the cold casing of his body, Sharek still felt something akin to duty. He had made the Necrons what they were. He had left them to escape his own guilt. But perhaps fate or cruelty had drawn him back to face the consequence of both. He sent his first message in tens of millions of years, broadcasting across hidden channels that only his kind could hear. It was not a command, but a warning. The galaxy shifts. The devourer comes. Across distant tomb worlds, ancient circuits stirred, and eyes of burning green opened in the dark. Whether they would heed his call or curse his name anew, he could not know. As the Silent King set his course back toward the galactic core, he felt the faintest stirrings of the old fire within him. Not hope, for such a thing was alien to his kind, but resolve. The Tyranids were not an enemy that could be bargained with, tricked, or broken. They could only be destroyed, or the galaxy itself would be reduced to silent, lifeless stone. For the first time since his exile began, Sharek did not drift aimlessly. His path was fixed, his purpose set. The galaxy had forgotten its king, but its king had not forgotten his galaxy. And if the stars themselves had to bleed to stop the coming hunger, so be it. The tendrils of Hive Fleet Nereth had by now wrapped themselves fully around the doomed system. What had once been scattered vanguard organisms had grown into a coordinated and overwhelming tide, guided by the distant but ever-present will of the hive mind. From the moment the bioships had eclipsed the stars, the fate of the system had been sealed. But in these final days, resistance had turned from futile defense into desperate, frenzied survival. The planetary capitals, once symbols of power and civilization, had become fortresses of steel and flesh, their skies filled with choking smoke and burning wreckage. Yet no, wall could keep the Tyranids out for long. Their forms flowed over defenses like water over stone, carving new paths through sheer force of biological ingenuity. In the capital city of Serek Prime, the last of the planetary militia made their stand. The avenues were choked with makeshift barricades of debris and shattered vehicles, their defenders firing into the seething masses that surged through the ruins. The air was thick with the scent of burning promethium and the acidic reek of ruptured tyrannid organisms. Above, the shadow of a harpy passed, its wings shedding spores that drifted down like poisonous snow. Men and women fought knowing that no reinforcements would come. The fleet in orbit had been obliterated days earlier in a battle that had seen the void lit with the dying fires of 100 ships. Amid this chaos, Magos Biology's Calver Tin continued his grim work deep within the catacombs beneath the city. He recorded every sound, every sight, every mutation in the tyrannid forms that stalked the surface. His voice was calm, almost detached, as if describing the dissection of a corpse rather than the slow death of a world. Yet behind his mechanical tone, there was an unspoken dread, a dawning realization that the patterns he observed hinted at something more than just another feeding swarm. The tyrannids were learning, adapting, refining themselves with each engagement. Every failed assault against the human lines was not a loss to them, but an experiment, a step toward the perfect method of eradication. On the surface, the defenders watched their ammunition dwindle as the enemy's numbers only seemed to grow. From the hive spires that had sprouted overnight in the outskirts, fresh broods poured forth, slick, chitinous horrors with adaptations tailored for the city's defenses. New beasts with carapaces impervious to las fire crawled along the walls, their talons carving through ferrocrete as though it were paper. Winged predators hunted through the streets, plucking defenders from rooftops and hurling them screaming into the waiting moors below. Each assault pushed the defenders further inward, until only the heart of Serek Prime remained, a burning, shattered monument to human stubbornness. Calver's last transmission was cut short by a tremor that shook the catacombs. A deep, reverberating sound followed, like the heartbeat of some vast, unseen god. He moved toward the source, his servo skulls drifting ahead, their lenses recording. Through the shattered stone he saw something moving, a shape so vast it could barely be comprehended, a creature whose bulk stretched into the darkness, its movements slow but deliberate. He realized in that moment that what he had thought of as the hive was only the surface manifestation of something far greater. The tunnels beneath Serek were not natural, nor were they built by human hands. They were the veins of the tyrannid organism itself, a living network that had already begun to root itself into the planet's very crust. Above, as night fell, the capital was swallowed whole. Bio-titans the size of hab-blocks strode through the ruins, their footsteps cracking stone and steel alike. Mycetic spores fell in endless waves, and the surviving defenders fought in streets that had become rivers of acidic ichor. In the governor's palace, the last surviving officers gathered for a final act of defiance, overloading the city's reactor in the hope of denying the enemy its prize. The explosion that followed lit the horizon in a blinding flash, vaporizing everything in its radius. For a brief moment, there was silence. But the swarm did not stop. The loss of biomass was meaningless to the hive mind, a minor wound that would heal in moments. The bioships in orbit descended lower, their feeder tendrils piercing the atmosphere, drawing the planet's oceans, soil, and air into their holds. Serek Prime was dead, and soon nothing would remain but a barren rock drifting through the void. The swarm had fed, and it would move on, hungrier than before, guided by an intelligence that spanned the stars. Far beyond the reach of mortal sight, in the cold gulfs between systems, the hive mind turned its gaze elsewhere. New prey awaited, new adaptations to be made, new worlds to consume. The fall of Seric Prime was not an end, but merely another note in the endless, devouring song of the Tyranids. And in that song, there was no mercy, no pause, no limit, only the eternal hunger that would one day see the stars themselves swallowed whole. Beneath the cold, unfeeling stars, the war for the Void Crown entered its 11th year. By now, the empires that had once waged war with banners held high and songs of victory in their hearts had become shadows of their former selves. Their soldiers hardened into creatures of habit, their leaders into prisoners of pride. The Eternal Regent, whose voice had once swayed the hearts of millions, now spoke rarely, his words measured and heavy with the knowledge of all that had been lost. The council chambers were silent more often than they were filled, the weight of the crown pressing like a phantom hand on every decision. The outer rings had been stripped bare. Worlds once green and fertile now hung as husks in space, their surfaces pitted and scorched, their cities' skeletal remains consumed by the quiet void. Fleets were no longer built for expansion, but for endurance, patched and repaired with the bones of fallen ships, each vessel a floating testament to decades of attrition. Yet still, none could abandon the war, for to do so was to yield the Void Crown to another's hands, and in that gesture, doom would follow. The crown had become more than an artifact. It was now a promise and a threat. The dominion of Sindral fought with desperation born not of greed, but of inevitability. Their ruler, Queen Selhara, had been told by her seers that the crown's loss would herald the fall of her bloodline and the burning of her capital. Each night she dreamt of the flames, and each day she ordered more troops into battles they could not win outright, as if by stacking the dead high enough, she could build a wall between her empire and fate itself. Across the void, the Iron Confederacy's Chancellor Harvoth was driven by a simpler motive. He could not bear the thought of his rival, the Regent, wielding such power. For him, the war was not about the salvation of his people, but the obliteration of another's glory. The Regent's fleet held the edge of the Stargrave expanse, a corridor of dead suns and drifting wreckage that had become the primary route toward the Crown's last recorded resting place. But the Regent's spies whispered that the Dominion had found another way, a hidden channel through a labyrinth of black holes known as the Maw of Erendor. The risk was beyond measure. One misstep in navigation would mean instant annihilation. But if the route was real, the Dominion could bypass the Regent's blockade entirely. Such a move would not only end the war, it would end the Regent's reign. On the 33rd day of the cycle, the Regent summoned Captain Vera to his war room. Vera was the last of the Obsidian Guard, an elite order sworn to protect the Regent's bloodline, though the rest of her brethren had fallen in the siege of Tenebrol. She had become the Regent's blade in the shadows, her loyalty unquestioned but her methods feared even among allies. The Regent spoke only 6 words to her: find the Maw, or die trying. She bowed without hesitation, though she knew the command was less an order than a death sentence. To navigate the Maw required not only skill, but the courage to stare into the madness of the void without succumbing to it. Meanwhile, the Crown itself, if it still existed, had begun to stir whispers across the galaxy. Traders spoke of a faint pulse felt through their ships' hulls when traveling near the Stargrave. Pilgrims claimed visions of a black sun devouring a world whole. The scholars of the Silent Choir, who had once declared the Crown inert, now retracted their stance, hinting that perhaps it was awakening, calling to those desperate or foolish enough to seek it Such rumors were poison to the regent's strategy, for desperation makes allies of enemies and traitors of friends. Indeed, within the regent's own council, fault lines began to show. Lord Mavren, keeper of the fleet, argued for abandoning the crown entirely, claiming the war was a slow suicide for the empire. High Marshal Yessen countered that without the crown, the regent's legitimacy would wither, and the Confederacy would descend upon them like carrion birds. The regent said nothing, watching them argue, knowing that every word spoken in those halls was likely reported to his enemies before the day was done. Trust had become an extinct commodity. Beyond the councils and war rooms, life for the common people had grown bleak. In the orbital slums above the regent's capital, children played among piles of scrap and wreckage, their laughter sounding more like defiance than joy. Food shipments were irregular, medicine scarce, and every face bore the hollow look of someone who had learned to live without expecting tomorrow to be better. They spoke the regent's name in hushed tones, not in reverence, but in fear that the mere mention might bring conscription or worse. And yet, in the darkness, there were those who still believed. In the lower decks of the battleship Vigilant, crew members carved crude sigils of the crown into the walls, whispering that it was destined to return to their people. For them, the crown was not an object of greed, but of hope, a relic that might bring an end to the endless cycle of war. Perhaps they were fools, but fools can change the tide of history if the moment is right. As the 11th year of war drew toward its close, three great forces began to converge: the regent's weary but unbroken fleet, the Dominion's desperate gamble through the moor, and the Confederacy's relentless push across the outer rings. Somewhere in the center of this tightening noose, the crown waited, its unseen presence bending the wills of leaders, breaking the backs of soldiers, and shaping the fate of empires. The void was silent, but it was not empty. It was listening, and soon it would answer. The passage through the moor of Erindor was a trial unlike any other, a gauntlet of shifting gravitational tides and chaotic warp eddies that threatened to tear even the most seasoned navigators apart. Captain Vera's ship, the Shadow's Fang, slipped through the narrow corridors between dying stars and collapsing neutron clusters, guided by the faintest flicker of ancient stellar maps and the steady hands of her helmsman. Every moment was a battle against unseen forces, space folding and warping around them, as if the universe itself sought to repel their passage. Inside the ship's command deck, Vera's eyes were sharp, her mind a tempest of focus and calculation. The moor was more than just a natural hazard. It was a test of will. Many ships had entered and never returned, swallowed by the labyrinthine folds of reality. Some whispered that the moor was a living entity, a guardian of secrets older than the stars, punishing those who dared seek the void crown. Vera neither believed nor disbelieved such tales. Superstition was a luxury for the fearful, and she could not afford fear, not with the fate of the regent's empire hanging in the balance. Behind her, the crew moved in practiced silence, each knowing their role, but none daring to speak unless necessary. The tension was palpable, as if the very walls held their breath. In the shadows of the lower decks, the murmurs of the crew betrayed their unease. Prayers to forgotten gods, whispered oaths to the emperor, and curses thrown into the void for luck. Vera ignored them all, for she knew the only way through the moor was not luck, but unwavering resolve and perfect timing. As they pushed deeper into the moor, the distortions grew more violent. Communications flickered, sensors warped, and the stars outside became twisted, fractured fragments of light. The Shadow's fang creaked and groaned, its ancient hull straining against unseen forces. Twice, the ship was nearly lost in spatial folds that threatened to tear its essence apart. But Vera's hand was steady on the controls, her mind weaving through the nightmare like a blade through silk. Then came the sight that stopped all breath, the hidden rift. A swirling tear in space, wider than any warp portal known to the Imperial navigators, framed by the remnants of shattered worlds and drifting asteroids. It pulsed with a dark light, like a wound in the fabric of reality itself. Through it lay the promised path, a shortcut to the heart of the Stargrave expanse, and hopefully to the crown. But no map had ever charted what lay beyond the rift, and none who had entered it had ever returned. Vera hesitated only briefly before giving the order to proceed. The ship plunged forward, hull lights flickering as the Shadow's fangs slipped beyond the threshold. Time and space seemed to stretch and contort, the stars replaced by roiling shadows and echoes of lost worlds. For a moment, the crew felt as if they were caught between existence and oblivion, held in a fragile balance by forces beyond comprehension. When the rift finally released them, they emerged into a system unlike any other. A shattered star at the center, surrounded by worlds twisted and broken by unknown forces. The wreckage of ancient fleets drifted silently, hulls cracked and lifeless. In the distance, faint pulses of energy blinked like dying fireflies, as if the very stars were trying to remember their purpose. Scanning the system, Vera's instruments detected a signature, faint but unmistakable, the Void Crown. It hovered above a dead moon, surrounded by a field of debris and old war relics. The artifact pulsed with an eerie light, casting long shadows across the shattered landscape below. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a reminder of power beyond reckoning. But the moment of triumph was shattered when alarms blared. The Shadow's fangs shuddered violently as unseen weapons struck its shields. From the darkness emerged sleek vessels, their design unlike any Imperial or Dominion craft. Their hulls bore the marks of age and decay, and yet they moved with deadly precision. The Silent King's forces had found them first. Vera's heart hammered, but she gave the order without hesitation. The Shadow's fang engaged in a desperate dance, weaving through volleys of ancient weaponry and countering with every missile and laser at their disposal. The battle was not just for survival, it was for the future of empires. As the fight raged, Vera caught sight of the Silent King's flagship, a colossal vessel radiating cold green light, its surface etched with runes older than time. The Necron monarch's presence was both a warning and a promise. None would claim the crown without paying its price. In the chaos, Vera realized the war for the Void Crown was no longer a matter of mortal ambition. It was a collision of legacies and fates, of ancient grudges and unstoppable forces. The Maw of Erendor had revealed its secret, but it had also laid bare the true cost of power. And in the shadow of dying stars, the Silent King watched, patient and unyielding, as destinies intertwined and the galaxy's fate hung in the balance. The night sky over the war-torn world of Varus Prime was streaked with the blood-red trails of falling stars. Missiles and firebombs heralding the final assault. The planet, once a jewel of the Outer Reach, had been ground to ruin over decades of siege and counterattack. Its surface a shattered wasteland where the echoes of countless battles still haunted the air. Now, in the heart of this dying world, the last great battle for the Void Crown was set to unfold, a confrontation that would decide not only the fate of empires, but the soul of the galaxy itself. Within the shattered citadel, Regent Malkar stood with his generals, his once proud armour dented and scorched by relentless combat. The crown, held secure in a vault beneath the throne room, pulsed faintly, as if aware of the approaching storm. Around him, the remaining forces of the Dominion and the Confederacy had formed a tentative alliance, bound by desperation rather than trust. Their eyes held a mixture of fear and resolve, knowing that this battle was their final chance. Across the shattered plains, Captain Vera led her loyal obsidian guard through the crumbling ruins, their steps silent against the debris. The scars of the moor still marked her mind, but there was no time for hesitation. The Silent King's forces, relentless and implacable, pressed down upon the planet like the coming of death itself. Their emerald eyes glowed in the twilight, and the hollow sound of their steps echoed through the canyons and broken streets. As the armies clashed, betrayals whispered in shadowed halls. Lord Mavren, once a trusted advisor to the regent, had secretly opened channels to the Necron monarch, hoping to barter survival for allegiance. His treachery was a dagger in the back, and when discovered, it ignited a chain reaction that fractured the fragile alliance. Soldiers found themselves fighting not only enemies, but former comrades, torn between loyalty and the instinct to survive. The Crown's influence twisted hearts and minds, its power both a beacon and a curse. In the midst of the chaos, Vera confronted the Silent King himself on the battlefield. His presence was otherworldly, a towering figure clad in obsidian carapace, eyes glowing with ancient light. Their duel was not one of brute force, but of wills, a clash that rippled through the fabric of reality. Words were exchanged, ancient and cryptic, revealing truths long buried beneath layers of time and betrayal. The Silent King spoke of debts unpaid, of oaths broken, and of the inevitability of the Void's judgment. Vera's resolve wavered as the weight of history pressed upon her. She saw the futility in endless war, the cost of ambition, and the sacrifice demanded by power. Yet she stood firm, knowing that to falter now was to doom all she held dear. Their battle echoed through the halls of eternity, a tragedy played out on a cosmic stage. As dawn broke over Varus Prime, the battlefield lay silent, but for the whispers of the wind through shattered spires. The crown, cracked and dim, rested where it had fallen. Leaders lay broken, some dead, others forever changed by the bitter taste of betrayal and loss. The galaxy held its breath, caught between an ending and a beginning. In that silence, one truth was clear. The Void Crown was more than a prize. It was a judgment, a reckoning of the soul of the galaxy. And those who sought it would find not glory, but the heavy cost of their own ambition. The sky above Varus Prime was heavy with ash and the faint glow of dying fires, casting long shadows over the scarred battlefield where empires had clashed and dreams had been shattered. The air was thick with the scent of blood and dust, mingling with the cold breath of approaching winter. The once mighty citadel now stood as a hollow monument to the cost of ambition, its walls fractured and blackened by betrayal and relentless war. Yet, within its shattered heart, the final reckoning awaited. The Silent King moved through the remnants of the throne room, his steps echoing against the broken marble. His eyes, pools of ancient light, scanned the scene, not with triumph, but with a solemn weight. The crown lay before him, fractured but still humming with potent energy, a relic of power and ruin intertwined. The centuries of waiting, exile, and sacrifice had led to this moment, a moment that held the fate of countless souls. Vera knelt nearby, her armor battered and stained, her spirit torn between duty and the crushing reality of loss. Her hands trembled as she reached out, feeling the crown's cold pulse beneath her fingertips. The voices of the dead whispered in her mind. Friends lost, enemies turned, promises broken. She had fought not just for a symbol, but for hope itself. Yet now that hope felt fragile, a flickering candle against an endless void. Across the room, Regent Malkar lay wounded, his breath shallow, but his eyes burning with the stubborn fire of a man who refused to yield. The betrayal of Lord Mavren had shattered their fragile alliance, leaving the Dominion fractured and vulnerable. Yet even in defeat, Malkar's gaze lingered on the crown, as if the artifact still held a thread of salvation or damnation that he could grasp. The Silent King spoke at last, his voice a deep, resonant timbre that seemed to reverberate through the very stones. He spoke of cycles unending, of empires born in fire and dying in shadow. He revealed that the crown was not merely a prize of conquest, but a catalyst, an ancient device designed to test the worth of civilizations, to judge their resilience and their sins. Its power was a double-edged sword, capable of creation and destruction, salvation and ruin. Vera rose, her heart heavy but resolute. She understood now that the war had never been about dominion or glory, but about survival. Survival not just of a people, but of the soul of the galaxy itself. She offered the crown back to the Silent King, a gesture of surrender and understanding. To wield such power was to carry a burden too great for any one being. The Silent King accepted, his form shimmering with the light of stars long dead. As he raised the crown, the shattered room filled with a radiant glow, washing away the shadows and illuminating the faces of those who had endured. The energy flowed outward, reaching into the void, into the hearts of distant worlds, signaling an end and a beginning. Outside, the fires began to die, the ash settled, and a fragile calm descended upon Varus Prime. The galaxy held its breath, caught between the memory of war and the uncertain dawn of peace. The Silent King vanished into the stars, the crown now a silent sentinel once more, its judgment past, but its legacy eternal. In the quiet that followed, those who survived knew that the cost of ambition was etched into their souls, a reminder that power without wisdom is a path to oblivion. The Void Crown's light faded, but its story would linger, an eternal warning whispered among the stars. Shadows lengthened, and the galaxy turned, forever changed. The last light of Varus Prime's dying sun cast long, melancholic rays across the barren plains, where silence now reigned supreme. The great wars, the betrayals, the sacrifices, all had come to their inevitable close beneath the watchful gaze of an uncaring cosmos. The Void Crown, once the fulcrum of ambition and ruin, lay dormant once more, its power sealed away in the depths of forgotten catacombs, waiting for a time when fate might call upon it again. Captain Vera stood alone at the edge of the shattered battlefield, her armor scarred, her body weary but her spirit unbroken. She looked toward the horizon where the stars began to pierce the encroaching darkness, feeling the cold weight of memory settle upon her like a shroud. The price paid had been immense. Friends lost to betrayal, empires broken by pride, and the silent toll of immortal powers playing their ancient game across the stars. She thought of the Silent King, the immortal monarch who had borne the burden of endless existence, watching civilizations rise and fall like fleeting shadows. His sacrifice had been more than physical. It was a surrender to the weight of time itself, a recognition that some powers were too vast, too terrible, to be wielded by mortal hands. In his exile and return, she saw a reflection of their own mortal struggle, a dance with fate that none could escape. The galaxy was quieter now, but it was not at peace. The scars of war ran deep, etched into the stars and the souls of those who remained. Immortality, once a coveted gift, revealed itself as a curse, a burden to witness endless cycles of glory and decay without rest. The crown's silence was a reminder that power without wisdom leads only to ruin. As dawn broke over the remnants of Varus Prime, Vera knelt and traced a finger through the dust, whispering a vow to remember, not just the fallen, but the lessons carved in their sacrifice. She understood that the true judgment was not in the possession of power, but in the choices made under its shadow. The stars, indifferent and eternal, shone coldly overhead. They bore witness to an empire's fall, a leader's rise and surrender, and the endless cycle of ambition that drives the cosmos onward. The Silent King's legacy was not one of conquest, but of solemn remembrance, a testament to the price of immortality and the fragile hope that someday, perhaps, the galaxy might learn from its own darkness. With one last glance toward the heavens, Vera turned away from the ruin and stepped into the uncertain dawn. The story had ended, but its echoes would ripple through eternity, whispered among the stars until time itself forgot.